Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Thanksgiving weekend 1991, Costa Mesa, California. A quiet suburban street hides a crime that will later shock forensic investigators and captivate the nation. Within hours, a newlywed celebration turns into one of the most disturbing domestic homicides on record. The victim, William Bill Nelson, 56, a retired pilot with a criminal past tied to drug trafficking. Just weeks before this holiday, he had married Omaima Nelson, a 23-year-old woman from Egypt he met through a whirlwind romance. Friends described Bill as larger than life, someone who enjoyed risk, while neighbors noticed the mismatch in age and culture but paid little attention. On Thanksgiving Day, there was no sign of conflict. By all outward appearances, it was just another quiet evening. But sometime between the holiday meal and the following morning, something irreversible occurred inside their Costa Mesa apartment. Bill Nelson vanished. Within minutes of the disappearance, his phone line went silent. Later that night, neighbors heard strange noises but assumed it was an argument, not a life-threatening event. What they didn't know was that the case would soon escalate into one of the most documented domestic homicides in Southern California. When police finally received a tip 2 days later, their entry into the Nelson residence revealed quiet anomalies: furniture out of alignment, half-prepared food abandoned, and personal belongings scattered in ways that suggested disorder, not burglary. The apartment didn't look like a home after a festive dinner. It looked like a place where something had gone badly wrong. Investigators worked carefully. No forced entry, no calls placed from Bill's phone after Thanksgiving night. Negative evidence like that mattered as much as the physical traces they were beginning to catalog. And in homicide work, the absence of expected activity often points investigators toward intent. Costa Mesa detectives quickly locked down the apartment as a crime scene. In doing so, they preserved what would later become crucial forensic evidence, from kitchen implements to trash bags that would undergo lab testing. Nothing was yet confirmed, but preliminary notes already suggested the disappearance wasn't voluntary. For a community where serious violence was rare, the sudden silence of a neighbor, combined with an unresponsive household, raised questions. Was this a case of domestic conflict gone fatal, or something staged to conceal a larger plan? The first steps were clear. Reconstruct the timeline from the holiday meal forward, identify when Bill Nelson's presence ended, and match that against witness statements and physical traces. The crime scene had spoken, but only in fragments. Costa Mesa detectives treated the Nelson residence as a controlled crime scene from the moment entry was authorized. The unit was small, one bedroom, one bathroom, modestly furnished. What drew attention were not obvious signs of violence, but subtle anomalies inconsistent with a normal domestic setting. A dining table was partially set, yet abandoned. Leftover food suggested a Thanksgiving meal that had been interrupted. In the living room, officers noted personal effects displaced without pattern. Purses emptied, clothing spread across furniture. It was disorder, but not the disorder of a burglary. There were no pry marks at the door, no broken glass, no indication of forced entry. That absence was recorded as negative evidence. Evidence recovery began in stages. Preliminary items logged included trash bags of unusual weight, containers from the refrigerator, and kitchen implements that did not align with meal preparation. Investigators applied working classifications, potentially related to concealment, potentially unrelated domestic waste. Nothing was confirmed until forensic analysis could be run at the lab. Digital searches inside the apartment produced further anomalies. Bill Nelson's wallet was missing, but his car keys remained. His phone showed no outgoing calls after late Thanksgiving night. No banking documents indicated voluntary travel. This contrast, absence of financial activity paired with the presence of essential items, was flagged by detectives as consistent with involuntary disappearance. From a geographic standpoint, the apartment was a ground-floor unit in a quiet Costa Mesa complex near the 405 freeway. Entry and exit routes were limited: a shared lot, a back patio door, and the main entry visible from neighbors' windows. That layout meant anyone moving large items would risk exposure. Officers canvassed the lot for surveillance, but in 1991, camera coverage was limited to commercial properties nearby. The lack of usable footage narrowed investigators' options. The apartment then became a static anchor point. Any movement out would have to be tracked through witness accounts or later discovered evidence. Detectives noted that the first phase of the investigation would require mapping the flow of items and identifying what, if anything, had been removed from the residence between Thanksgiving night and police entry 2 days later. Procedurally, every bag, every container was secured for chain of custody transfer. Neighbors were re-interviewed, this time with a focus on exact hours, sounds, or unusual vehicle activity. The method was slow but deliberate. In homicide cases, the smallest irregularity, an engine starting at the wrong hour, a door opening too often, can define the window of the crime. What emerged was a working picture. Bill Nelson had not left voluntarily. His essential possessions remained, his phone had gone silent, and his household environment was altered in ways not consistent with robbery. The apartment, quiet on the outside, carried forensic signatures of internal conflict. By the time Costa Mesa detectives had secured the Nelson apartment, their focus shifted to the intangible record, digital communications, banking history, and transactional behavior. In homicide investigations, these sources frequently establish motive, opportunity, and timeline continuity where physical evidence leaves gaps. Investigators subpoenaed William Bill Nelson's financial records. Bank statements revealed steady deposits from a private pension and aviation-related disability benefits. Credit cards showed consistent usage for gas, groceries, and occasional restaurant bills through mid-November 1991. After Thanksgiving evening, no further transactions occurred. The absence of financial activity was logged as negative evidence, signaling interruption rather than voluntary disappearance. Parallel review of call records from the Nelson residence showed a similar cutoff. Friends reported Bill often used his landline and occasionally his car phone for short business calls. The logs indicated no outgoing calls after late Thanksgiving night. Omaima Nelson's phone activity presented a different picture. Sporadic calls to friends, including attempts to arrange use of vehicles, appeared in the hours after the holiday. Detectives documented these as preliminary indicators of her movements, but none were confirmed until matched against interviews. Working analysis of the couple's finances revealed another anomaly. Bill's wallet, unaccounted for in the apartment search, had contained multiple credit cards. Within days of his disappearance, attempts were made to use those cards at local ATMs and retail counters. Surveillance coverage at the time was limited, but the transaction receipts placed Omaima's signature on at least one attempt. Investigators classified these records as confirmed evidence linking her to post-incident financial activity. The geographic chain tightened. ATM attempts occurred at locations within Costa Mesa and Irvine, areas directly accessible via the 405 and 55 freeways. Each attempt occurred within minutes of her documented calls, reinforcing temporal alignment between communications and financial behavior. Detectives constructed a working theory. If Omaima was moving across these points in possession of Bill's cards, then Bill himself was unlikely to be alive or voluntarily absent. When Omaima was brought in for questioning, she offered shifting accounts. First that Bill had traveled, later that she herself had been abused and reacted in self-defense. Detectives cross-checked her claims against the digital trail. The silence of Bill's accounts and the sudden misuse of his financial instruments contradicted the idea of voluntary absence. Her statements were logged as inconsistent testimony, an element later used to challenge credibility. The review of digital and financial records provided investigators with leverage. While the apartment had offered only partial physical anomalies, the paper and call trails suggested financial exploitation. That pattern, death followed by unauthorized use of accounts, fit established crime typologies involving intimate partner homicide with financial motive. By the time the financial and call records were mapped, detectives turned to the people behind the data. Victimology came first. William Bill Nelson, 56, was known to friends as a former pilot who had once faced a federal narcotics case. He lived in Costa Mesa on a steady income and favored cash for certain expenses. Those who interacted with him described confidence, sometimes control, and an impulsive streak. Weeks before the holiday, he had married a 23-year-old woman he met quickly and married even faster. That compressed courtship mattered. In homicide work, sudden marriages with large age and power gaps are flagged because they can change financial control, housing, and daily routine within days. Investigators then documented the new spouse's background. She was an immigrant with a limited support network and sporadic employment. Prior acquaintances described a pattern of short-term relationships and expectations around money. The records already on the table, possession of the victim's cards, use attempts at machines across Orange County, and the flat line on the victim's phone after Thanksgiving pointed away from a voluntary absence and toward intimate partner risk. The question became whether this was sudden self-defense or an intentional act wrapped in a later story. Interviews were methodical. Neighbors in the Costa Mesa complex reported little noise during the holiday night, no shouting that suggested a prolonged fight. That absence was logged the same way as no forced entry, as negative evidence. Friends who saw the couple during the brief marriage noted friction over money, vehicles, and who held the keys, literal and figurative. Detectives recorded those statements, not as proof of motive but as context for what the financial trail already suggested. Medical findings were next. The coroner identified multiple sharp force injuries to the chest affecting the heart and lungs. Ligature impressions were documented on the victim's wrists. Those injuries, taken together, were inconsistent with a simple, chaotic fight. They aligned more closely with restraint followed by sustained assault. The lab also confirmed that remains recovered from the apartment and related containers were the victims, with a total mass near 150 pounds and a substantial amount never recovered. The examination could not speak to state of mind, but it did speak clearly to mechanics and sequence. The suspect's narrative shifted over interviews. She alleged sexual assault and restraint, claiming she reacted to survive. Detectives cross-checked that claim against medical documentation from the time period. There was no supporting exam consistent with a sexual attack on her, while the victim's injuries suggested binding. The absence of corroboration on one side and the presence of physical indicators on the other side created a credibility problem not solved by later explanations. In a case report, that is where investigators write what they can defend. Statement inconsistent with objective findings. Victimology also accounts for pre-incident risk factors. Bill's history, older, financially established, known to carry cash, placed him at increased financial exposure within a volatile new relationship. The spouse's limited resources and fast elevation to joint access added a second risk layer. Combined with the post-incident use of his accounts, the pattern moved beyond tension into exploitation indicators recognized by financial crime analysts. Police do not have to prove motive to file a homicide charge, but a coherent narrative helps a jury weigh intent versus panic. Detectives interviewed acquaintances who had contact with the suspect during the weekend. One acquaintance described a request for help disposing of parts and an offer of money said to come from a safe. That statement was cross-referenced with a search that found no such cash reserve. The contradiction supported an inference, a promise used to recruit help that never existed. Prosecutors later treated that as evidence of planning rather than a spontaneous act. The geography remained tight and consistent. The relationship began in Orange County. The apartment was in Costa Mesa. Attempted transactions clustered around Costa Mesa and Irvine, and the acquaintance who contacted police lived in nearby Anaheim. No evidence suggested an out-of-area suspect or interstate movement. The chain kept the case local and manageable, which is why timelines could be lined up within minutes. Call attempts, card swipes, and witness contact times converged inside the same weekend and the same small radius. As the working picture solidified, investigators returned to what could be proved without conjecture. The victim stopped all communications after the holiday evening. He did not use his accounts again. His remains were recovered inside his household environment and linked containers. There was no forced entry. A person with immediate access to his home, vehicles, and cards was captured in the paper record moving across local banks and stores. In towns like Costa Mesa, murders aren't just crimes. They stress test the assumptions of ordinary life. Neighbors, holidays, quiet apartments. The silent apartment mattered because silence left only the record, and the record aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Victimology closed the gap between scene and story. It established why this particular pairing escalated quickly. An older partner with assets, a newer partner with access. A holiday that reduced outside contact, and a setting where no one would intrude. When a spouse asserts survival against abuse, investigators must test that claim with the full body of evidence. Here, the medical and financial findings pulled in the opposite direction. That tension didn't end the analysis. It directed the next step. The case was ready to move from investigation to charging. Once the autopsy findings and financial records were in, Prosecutors in Orange County converted the investigative file into a set of elements they could prove. The charge had to fit the record. Not rumor, not emotion. Under California law, second-degree murder would center on malice shown by the nature of the assault and the conduct that followed. Premeditation was debated, but the team chose a theory that was strong where the evidence was strongest. The state's narrative began with time. Within minutes of the last confirmed activity from William Bill Nelson on Thanksgiving night, all calls and routine transactions tied to him stopped. Later that night and into the weekend, card attempts and phone contacts tied to his spouse appeared around Costa Mesa, Irvine, and Anaheim. Prosecutors framed that timing as a clean break. The victim's life halts. A single household actor continues to move through banks and stores. It wasn't dramatic, it was linear. Next came mechanics. The coroner documented fatal sharp force injuries to the chest, damaging the heart and lungs, and ligature impressions on the wrists. In the state's view, those findings were inconsistent with a brief defensive struggle and aligned more closely with restraint followed by a sustained assault. Prosecutors made clear they were not trying the defendant for dismemberment itself. They argued post-incident handling as consciousness of guilt, conduct that explained why so much of the victim's mass was never recovered. The kitchen appliances and containers were introduced for what they showed about concealment, not for shock value. The emphasis stayed on causation and intent. Financial motive was presented as a pattern, not a headline. The paper trail showed a sudden move to use the victim's cards within the same weekend his communications ceased. Witness statements added another layer. An acquaintance reported being offered money from a safe in exchange for help with disposal, a claim that wasn't supported when the residence was searched. Prosecutors argued that the promise of cash pointed to planning and exploitation rather than panic. Again, they avoided speculation and anchored each statement to a document, a receipt, or an interview note that could be authenticated in court. The defense filed standard pretrial motions. They challenged the admissibility of certain photographs as more prejudicial than probative and sought to narrow expert testimony about injury sequence. The court allowed core pathology findings, fatal chest wounds and wrist impressions, while limiting cumulative or unnecessarily graphic exhibits. Statements by the defendant were also litigated. The judge permitted the jury to hear inconsistent accounts about travel, self-defense, and the timeline, finding the interviews voluntary and within constitutional bounds. For the prosecution, those inconsistencies were not window dressing. They were a way to compare narrative against physical fact. To prevent the case from drifting into character prosecution, the state used prior acts evidence sparingly. Where allowed, they tied it to intent or common plan rather than propensity, staying within evidentiary rules. The goal was to show that the post-holiday sequence, card attempts, solicitations for help, and an apartment set with quiet anomalies, fit a pattern of calculated decision-making around money and control. Jurors would hear that in plain language, not as diagnosis, but as conduct. Chain of custody received its own lane. Every bag, every container, each appliance sample moved under seal from the apartment to the lab and then to secure storage. Prosecutors anticipated defense attacks on contamination and prepared technicians to explain methods in clear terms: where an item was found, when it was sealed, and who touched it. The state's case didn't need everything to be perfect. It needed enough to be reliable. In true crime work, consistency over spectacle keeps a file trial ready. Finally, the geography stayed tight by design. The district attorney's team mapped the apartment in Costa Mesa, the ATM and retail nodes in Costa Mesa and Irvine, and the witness contact in Anaheim. No stops outside that radius were needed to prove opportunity or intent. The map the jury would see was small, local, and repeated across exhibits. The same streets, the same weekend, the same narrowed window. In towns like Costa Mesa, murders aren't just crimes. They disrupt the basic assumption that home is safe. Here, the state argued, home was the place of fatal assault and the center of concealment. By the time jury questionnaires went out, the file spoke with one voice. The victim ceased all activity after the holiday. Medical findings supported restraint and lethal wounds. The person with immediate access to his home and financial instruments moved through the county in his place. The apartment bore the signs of post-incident handling, and an offer of money to secure help with disposal could not be reconciled with a fight-or-flight account. The prosecution's theory of second-degree murder matched the evidence they could carry through cross-examination. Jury selection in Orange County moved quickly once the file was set. Over consecutive days, both sides questioned prospective jurors about domestic violence, financial motive, and their tolerance for clinical forensic evidence. By the end of the week, a panel was sworn, and the court set clear guardrails. This case would be tried on documents, expert testimony, and witness accounts, not spectacle. Opening statements were plain. The state focused on sequence and intent. A holiday evening, communications from William Bill Nelson stop, and within hours, unauthorized financial attempts appear, while his remains are later identified from the Costa Mesa apartment and related containers. The defense offered a counter-narrative: a sudden fight, sexual assault, and a panicked response from a younger spouse with little power. The question for the jury was not whether a death occurred. It was whether the law read those facts as murder with malice or a lesser defensive event. Witnesses took the stand in a deliberate order. Detectives walked jurors through the secured apartment, chain of custody logs, and a map of the Costa Mesa Irvine-Anaheim corridor. A financial records analyst authenticated card attempt receipts and timestamps, matching them to call activity attributed to the defendant after Thanksgiving. A forensic pathologist testified to lethal sharp force injuries to the chest with damage to the heart and lungs and described ligature impressions on the wrists. The expert kept to mechanics. The court curtailed graphic detail and focused the jury on causation and sequence. A key civilian witness recounted being asked for help disposing of parts, alongside an offer of cash from a supposed safe. When investigators later found no such reserve, prosecutors argued that the offer served one purpose: to recruit assistance and conceal the crime. The defense cross-examined on memory and motive, suggesting exaggeration. Jurors watched the witness's demeanor as much as his words. What survived cross was the tight alignment of that call with the established timeline. The defendant's statements, shifting between travel claims, self-defense, and partial denials, were admitted with limiting instructions. Prosecutors used them sparingly, contrasting them against the fixed record. No outgoing calls from Bill after the holiday evening, immediate financial activity tied to his cards by someone else, and the discovery of his remains inside his own household environment. When the defense raised the abuse narrative, the state returned to the autopsy: injuries consistent with restraint and repeated chest trauma, not a brief defensive struggle. Jury instructions centered on second-degree murder, malice implied from the act itself and the conduct that followed. The judge explained how the panel should weigh intent, credibility, and consciousness of guilt without allowing emotion or disgust to substitute for proof. It was a clean charge for a clinical record. Later that week, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing followed, imposing a term of 27 years to life in state prison. In the hallway outside, there were no headlines about premeditation or grand conspiracy. This was a local case tried on local facts: Costa Mesa, Irvine, and Anaheim forming a compact geography, a holiday window, a domestic scene, a financial pattern, and a medical record that spoke without embellishment. In towns like Costa Mesa, murders aren't just crimes. They press the justice system to stay disciplined when the evidence is disturbing. Here, discipline carried the verdict. After the verdict, the file moved from trial posture to post-conviction review. The focus shifted from proving a crime to testing whether the conviction rested on admissible evidence and sound procedure. Appeals in California examine the record that already exists. They don't retry facts. Omaima Nelson's team challenged the admission of certain photographs, aspects of the interview statements, and the framing of autopsy testimony about lethal chest wounds and wrist ligature impressions. The appellate discussion stayed clinical. Was the evidence probative of cause and intent, or did it risk unfair prejudice? The ruling kept the conviction intact. The court found the core proof: abrupt cutoff of the victim's communications, the identification of his remains from the Costa Mesa apartment and related containers, and the documented post-incident financial attempts, was properly admitted and sufficient when viewed as a whole. With the judgment affirmed, custody transferred to state prison. Classification placed Nelson in the women's system under a life-term schedule with parole eligibility after the minimum period. Institution records looked for programming, disciplinary history, and insight statements, what the board later calls acceptance of responsibility. Prison is not just a place of punishment. In the parole context, it is also a repository of data. Calendared hearings review the same facts the trial established, then add the inmate's conduct and current risk assessment. Years later, the first parole hearings convened. The board drew its timeline from the same weekend of Thanksgiving 1991. Communications from William Bill Nelson ceased within minutes of the last normal activity. Unauthorized attempts appeared on his cards later that night and into the weekend across Costa Mesa and Irvine, and his remains were recovered inside his domestic setting. Board members asked about narrative consistency. They compared the inmate's account, self-defense in response to alleged abuse, with fixed points in the file. Autopsy mechanics consistent with restraint, negative evidence of no forced entry, and the alignment of card attempts with her subsequent movements. Victim impact statements were read into the record. California law allows families to describe the harm in measured terms. Those statements are not evidence of guilt, but bear on parole suitability. They press the board to consider whether the inmate's current explanation minimized planning and financial exploitation. Insight in this setting means more than remorse. It means the ability to articulate why the crime occurred without shifting blame to the victim or to circumstances disproven by the file. Across successive hearings in the 2000s, 2010s, and again in the 2020s, panels reached similar conclusions. The risk profile remained too high. The reasoning repeated in parole minutes was pragmatic, not moralistic. Continued inconsistency with the medical record, emphasis on post-incident conduct, using the victim's cards and attempting to recruit help, and the absence of a stable, verifiable release plan that materially lowered risk. Panels cited the same geography and timing that convinced the trial jury, a compact map of Costa Mesa, Irvine, Anaheim, and a weekend where the victim's life halted and the offender's activity continued. There were no sweeping doctrinal changes in these reviews. The law did not need new technology to resolve what happened in 1991. Cell site analysis and GPS were not at issue. This case predated those tools. Instead, the board relied on durable facts and validated risk instruments: disciplinary record, program participation, psychological evaluation, and the inmate's answers about the crime. Where the answers broke from the physical and financial record, the board found insufficient insight. Public safety standard met. Parole denied. Post-conviction litigation sometimes includes petitions for writs or claims of ineffective assistance. Here, none of those efforts overturned the core ruling. The legal posture stayed steady. Second-degree murder, 27 to life, conviction affirmed. The prison location changed over the years within the California system, but the status line did not, still incarcerated. As of today's date, the sentence remains active. The board's schedule will come again. Denials set multi-year deferrals, and each hearing revisits the same questions. Is the inmate's version of events consistent with the record? Does the conduct, since incarceration, reduce risk below the threshold? And does the proposed release plan protect the community? This is where human context matters without bending facts. Families live with the aftermath. Communities absorb the lesson that intimate partner homicide often presents as a quiet apartment, a missing person, and an account that shifts under scrutiny. In towns like Costa Mesa, murders aren't just crimes. They pressure every institution to stay exacting, to measure words against documents, and to keep verdicts grounded in what the evidence will bear. When parole boards read from the file decades later, they are not reliving the trial. They are auditing whether understanding has finally caught up to the truth the record established. In this case, the answer has stayed no. What carried through each review was the same forensic spine. The victim's communications stopped later that night. No forced entry, remains recovered from the home environment, credit cards moving without him, and statements that could not reconcile with autopsy mechanics. That is not conjecture. It is the line that held from the kitchen to the courtroom to the parole hearing room. The story has never been two stories. It is one sequence the justice system read the same way at every stage. By the end of this file, the record is stable. A holiday evening in Costa Mesa ends with a sudden stop in the victim's routine. Within minutes, his phone activity goes silent and never resumes. Later that night and into the weekend, Card attempts tied to his accounts appear across a compact Orange County radius, aligning with calls attributed to the person inside his household. The apartment holds quiet anomalies rather than signs of a break-in. Inside law enforcement reports, those are the hinges of the case. Time breaks, movement continues, and the scene reads closed from the outside. The household environment remains the anchor. Neighbors do not report forced entry. Doors and windows show no pry marks. Essentials like keys are present while the victim's wallet is not. Containers and appliances are secured under chain of custody, cataloged, and transferred for lab work. The methodical tone matters. Nothing is inferred that the record cannot carry. What is not present, the missing sounds of a protracted struggle, the absence of exit activity by the victim, earns the same evidentiary weight as what is present. Negative evidence is still evidence when it narrows the field. The proof set stays layered and clinical. Physical findings document lethal sharp force injuries to the chest with damage to the heart and lungs, and wrist impressions consistent with restraint. Digital and financial logs corroborate conduct. Unauthorized use attempts on the victim's cards cluster near Costa Mesa and Irvine. Call records place the suspect's communications within the same windows. Witness statements align with those timestamps, including a solicitation for help with disposal paired to a promise of cash later shown not to exist. Each piece is anchored to a receipt, a report, or an interview note. If a fact cannot be authenticated, it is not used to advance the case. Geography never drifts. The map is small and specific. Costa Mesa as the residence and point of recovery, Irvine as the location of ATM and retail attempts, Anaheim as an acquaintance's contact point. No side trips, no speculative drives. That compact chain is why the story reads as one story. In towns like Costa Mesa, murders aren't just crimes. They test the ordinary protections of home, holiday, and neighbor oversight. A tight map keeps a jury and a community inside facts they recognize. From charging through verdict, the theory stays matched to what can be proved. Second-degree murder in California rests on malice drawn from the act and the aftermath. Lethal injuries inconsistent with a brief defensive struggle, immediate exploitation of the victim's finances, and conduct consistent with concealment rather than panic. The court trims spectacle and keeps the jury on sequence and mechanics. The result is not cinematic. It is reliable. Appeals confirm the sufficiency and admissibility of the core record. Parole panels in later years measure insight against the same spine, timeline break, negative entry, medical mechanics, and the post-incident financial trail, and find the explanations do not reconcile with the documents. There is a human edge here worth stating plainly, without dramatics. Domestic homicide often looks ordinary until it doesn't. Prevention starts in the unremarkable details. A sudden communication blackout, a wallet that moves without its owner, a holiday that keeps outsiders away. When those signs surface, families and institutions should act early. Welfare checks logged, financial alerts investigated, statements tested against records. The system worked in this case because discipline held. Investigators recorded what they saw, prosecutors charged what they could prove, and jurors were instructed on the law rather than emotion. This case now lives in training rooms because it demonstrates how a disciplined file can resolve a disturbing crime without drifting into conjecture. The lesson is not to harden hearts. It is to strengthen methods. Compare statements to timestamps. Give negative evidence the weight it deserves. Keep geography tight. And when a narrative contradicts the medical and financial record, let the record lead. I'm closing this case with one truth. Safety grows when we take small signals seriously. Sudden silence, routines that stop, money that moves without reason. I share these cases so we act early, check on one another, and trust records over rumor. Which part of this crime taught you the most? The timeline, scene discipline, medical findings, or the financial trail? Tell me your take and where you're watching from. If this hit or missed for you, say why. If you found value, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case. Your voice keeps this work honest.